Caregiving tasks. Take an inventory of essential supplies in your loved one's home. Make a list of the care recipient's medications. Schedule regular calls to fight isolation. Finally, take care of yourself too. Follow the Centers for Disease Control's guidelines for coronavirus safety.
Let me get in.
Have we got enough people to start this meeting?
No. A quorum is 5.
There we are. Okay, let's call this meeting to order. Notice of an open work session to the City Council of the City of North Kansas City, Missouri, March 2, 2021. Eric?
Thank you, sir. We've discussed with the council a discussion of development generally in the city of North Kansas City, and we proposed a 3-meeting schedule to you. We had a discussion of that at your last council meeting, and we'll have more discussion of next steps during your regular council session tonight. First part of that discussion, we have scheduled a work session tonight to have a review of the 2016 city master plan. And so in a moment, our Community Development Director, Sarah Copeland, will begin that review. I will note that we did hear from Councilmember Toll just a little bit earlier, indicating that she would not be able to make the work session tonight. With regard to the presentation, I'm sure that there will be questions and such. In the interest of trying to get it through and done in an hour, it might be best if you could hold your questions until the conclusion of the presentation. But if you do have any questions that you'd like to ask during the course of it, then just let us know, and I will call on you. But at this point, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Sarah, who will go through a PowerPoint that she's prepared. So, Sarah.
Well, good evening, Mayor and Council. Kim, if you want to start the PowerPoint, you can go ahead to the next slide. For tonight's overview of the master plan, I wanted to start first by talking about the purpose of having a comprehensive master plan for a community and how communities generally use their comprehensive plans, and then talk about the development of our plan in 2015 to 2016, both the analysis that we used in helping to craft the plan and the community engagement that we engaged in order to put everything together, and then talk a little bit about outcomes from the plan since it was adopted. I'm happy if you want to interrupt with questions, that's fine with me. Although if it's something that I just haven't gotten to in the presentation, I might ask you to wait until we get to that item. Next slide, please, Kim. So elements of a plan, according to the Missouri Revised Statutes, we are empowered to undertake our planning by the state of Missouri. But what they require is very vague. We're encouraged to include recommendations for the physical development and use of land, and we may include planning for streets and public places, utilities, replanning blighted districts, and other items as deemed appropriate. So unlike some states, which are very prescriptive about what must be included, Missouri is very vague and leaves it up to individual communities to determine what is appropriate for their comprehensive plan. So it allows each community to really think about what are the issues facing us, what are our concerns, what do we want to work on as a community to determine the table of contents for their individual comprehensive plan. And it means the plans vary quite a bit from community to community. The way I think of it, though, is a little different from just what's listed in our Missouri Revised Statutes. Kim, if you want to go to the next slide, I really think of planning as a series of questions that we are asking each other, and we're developing consensus in our community around the answers to these questions. So planning is a process of getting the community together to discuss, how did we get here? What is our history and our background as a community? And what is our shared vision for the future? What are our current needs as a community? And what are our top priorities among those needs? Who do we need to involve in this whole conversation? How can we achieve our vision for the future? So it's a process of discussing these questions, discussing even what questions we might want to ask and discuss as a group, and then reaching some consensus around those answers. And we package that into a document that helps focus our energies as we move forward. You go to the next slide, please. Jesse Smith asked a great question at our last meeting about timeframes, and that isn't a very important element of a comprehensive plan. And when you think about the time frame for a plan, there are really a couple of elements to that. It helps to start with thinking about the lifespan of development. So residential development, particularly single family residential, is very long-lived. When you have single family homes built, you think about those as having a 100+ year life cycle. Even if the individual structure does not last for 100 years, if there's a fire or an area starts to, there are a lot of tear downs and people building larger houses, that area is going to maintain its residential character for a long time. Commercial development these days, you think of more of a 20 to 50 year lifespan for that development. Still, we're talking about long-term life cycles. The lifespan of infrastructure, similarly, we're talking about 50+ years when we're putting in new infrastructure. So these are long-term decisions that are being made. And as we see in Northgate, sometimes just the process of development can be a long time period. So we're not talking about short-term decisions. So a planning horizon, we're really trying to look long-term, 20+ years into the future to think about our goals for 20 years from now. What would we like North Kansas City to be like in, when we did this project in 2015, it was what would we like North Kansas City to be like in 2035? Because we're thinking long-term. This is a major difference from the council's strategic plan, where that is a much more immediate term document. That's a strategic plan that gets updated every year. We skipped last year because of the pandemic, but generally that's updated every year when the council has its strategic planning retreat, and it is much more short-term, whereas the master plan is a long-term document. That does not necessarily mean that the individual master plan lasts you for 20 years. But the lifespan of a master plan really depends. You might have a sudden economic shock. For example, a community that has one large major employer that suddenly closes. That community might determine, we really need to think about the future and how we deal with this. A lot of communities, if they have a disaster of some sort as the part of the disaster recovery process, might update their plans. On the flip side, more positive notes, if you have a period of intense investment that's, good things happening, you might determine that, we really need to take stock of where we are now because our needs and our priorities might have changed because of this investment. So there are a lot of different reasons why lifespans of master plans really vary quite a bit. When we updated the plan in 2015, we were updating a plan that had been mostly prepared in 2003. So it was about 12 years old. The city of Kansas City right now is updating their master plan. It's a plan that was completed in the 1990s. So it was quite a bit older. So there's no set, if your plan is a good plan, it lasts you for X number of years. It really varies quite a bit. If you go to the next slide, please. How then communities, once you've completed your plan, how do communities use a plan? Well, fundamentally, a master plan provides a legal foundation for all of your subsequent land use decisions. So rezonings, conditional use permits, master plan development applications, those should all be based on the master plan as its foundation. And when you read staff reports for any of these, when we're making our recommendation, at some point in that staff report, we are referring back to the master plan and what it calls for that particular area in the city. In addition, a master plan also sets some shared expectations for development between the city as a government and private developers and residents. It establishes, these are areas that we expect to be stable neighborhoods. Here's where we're expecting change, but this type of change is what we're expecting, so that there's shared expectation for the future. And people have a sense of comfort and stability when they're making major investments, whether that's buying your home or that's, building a new building or moving your business to North Kansas City. We also use the plan when we're evaluating incentive requests. And one of the things we ask applicants to do in submitting an application for economic development incentives is to explain how their project will help us meet the goals of our master plan. The plan also guides our infrastructure investments. A great example of this would be the Armour Road redevelopment area, 1 North, where we did a lot of planning before we started making infrastructure investments there in new roads and water and sewer lines and all of the other utility needs in that area. We've done a lot of planning, and the Armour Road redevelopment area framework plan was incorporated into our master plan. And the plan also supports grant applications and funding requests. For example, all of the grant applications and Surface Transportation Fund requests that we've made to the Mid-America Regional Council, their applications ask, is this part of your comprehensive plan? Is this included in your comprehensive plan? And to explain how. And that's part of their evaluations before they make grant decisions and funding awards. So a number of ways that we use the plan. And so once you complete this kind of project, it's not something that then sits, it's something that's an ongoing reference and guide for other projects that we undertake. Next slide, please. So when we started this project in 2015, for the project itself, we had a number of goals. One goal was to establish a clear vision for the council and the planning commission and all of our stakeholders for the future of North Kansas City. And we also wanted to specifically evaluate our economic development potential and discuss goals and strategies for ongoing economic development. We wanted to identify future redevelopment areas and to establish a framework for new zoning ordinance to help guide future redevelopment, whether that's large projects or small projects. And a key goal for the process also was to engage both residents and the business community. I think one of the unique things about North Kansas City is that our residents and our businesses are really two distinct groups, and there's not always a lot of overlap. So we were really clear at the beginning that we needed to be discussing this project with both parts of our community, the people who live here and the people who are running their businesses here. Next slide, please. So that brings us to the actual development of our plan. If you want to go ahead to the next slide. One of the key underpinnings of the plan was the market analysis that we had done at the beginning of this process. And that's Appendix A to the master plan, is that market analysis document that discusses all of the findings. And this was really an important part of our overall project, was really trying to make sure that everybody was on the same page about what is our market for residential development, for commercial space, for office space, for industrial space, so that we understood the forces that were facing us at the time. Some of the key residential findings here is that the residential housing market in North Kansas City is really strong for younger people, for renters, for some first-time home buyers, for empty nesters and seniors. Not particularly a strong housing market for families, mostly because a lot of families want more space than we are able to provide. And we have a lot of very competitive choices in the neighborhoods immediately around us and, you know, in the Northland, in the rest of Clay County. It's very hard for us to compete with those other neighborhoods that have just more space for people to spread out. And I'm sure all of you can think of somebody you know who has moved out of North Kansas City because they had a family and they just decided they needed more space. On the flip side of that, because we're a strong market for smaller households, that gives us the ability to target edgier modern urban housing, such as the development that is happening in the Crossroads, the River Market right now, and some of the multifamily development that we're seeing happening, you know, right now in North Kansas City. There's also a strong market for smaller infill for townhome development, similar to what we have going on in Northgate Village right now. But really, the goal of some of the findings here was that more housing is needed to support retail development in North Kansas City. At the time that we were doing this project, there was a lot of concern about having more retail development in downtown. And the finding was, you know, partly that if we wanted to have a stronger retail component to downtown North Kansas City, we needed to see more housing development to help support that. Next slide, please. So here, in discussing the retail and commercial market findings, again, more population is needed to help expand the retail offerings here in North Kansas City. We do have a very strong daytime population with employees coming here to work, but ultimately the spending from employees here has a minimal impact on our overall market for retail. And if you think about, you know, your own day-to-day life, if you're, you know, going to the office in, you know, regular times, what kind of spending do you do during the day? You might go out to get lunch, you might run some quick errands, but you're probably not doing a lot of shopping and spending to help support retail development. People tend to do that closer to where they live. So that additional population is really needed to help support expanded retail in North Kansas City. But we also have an opportunity to try to pursue local or regionally based businesses who are not going to be quite so wedded to just the numbers of I drop a pin and I look at the 1 and 3 and 5 mile trade area, the way that national retailers might. Next slide, please. We do have a strong industrial market, so we need to continue to support our productive industrial areas. But the market analysis also found that we have some areas that are obsolete for industrial spaces. We have lower ceiling heights in some of our older buildings. We have areas that we don't have the same space for truck courts and maneuvering. So some of that space is starting to transition to other uses. And we are the market analysis encouraged us to think about diversifying business mix and place-making investments that would help support office and other employment uses. You go to the next slide. This is a chart illustrating the industrial market. We are still one of the larger submarkets for industrial space in the Kansas City metro, but we are not a growing submarket. And in fact, the chart shows that we lost industrial space between 2004 and 2014. So it's really important for us to support the industrial space we have so that we can continue to be a strong submarket. But that just points out that it's also important for us to consider other ways to support office and other employment uses here that aren't reliant on modern industrial market standards. If you go to the next slide. So that is really an overview of the market analysis that we did. It really provided a foundation of information for the plan to support the development of our vision and strategies, but the actual development of that vision was done via community engagement. And we had an advisory committee of 12 people that was appointed by the mayor to help guide the development of this master plan that met throughout the process to talk about their thoughts about vision and desired outcomes, and to evaluate all the information that we gathered and what we were hearing from the community, and to help give some focus to the work that we were doing. If you go to the next slide, please. The really keystone of our community engagement was Discovery Week, which was a week-long charrette. We moved into 310 Armour, which is an empty storefront that Northtown Realty allowed us to use for the week. This was an opportunity for us to continue to gather some information from the community. We conducted 22 stakeholder interviews, held 6 focus groups, and 2 advisory committee meetings to present the data we gathered through the market analysis and other work, and to really start honing in on the vision and the goals for the rest of the master plan. And that culminated in a community workshop where we presented what really turned into the outline of our master plan for feedback from the community. Next slide, please. That wasn't the only community engagement we did, but as I said, it was really a keystone of the overall process where we had gathered all of this data. And Discovery Week was really kind of the culmination of doing that. Analyzed conditions, and then moving forward, we established a community-based vision, created our citywide planning frameworks, and then started to identify focus areas and craft implementation strategies. So the next slide shows the foundation of all of that for the master plan became the vision. The vision for North Kansas City is to support existing places and create unique and sustainable activity centers with enhanced character that can be branded to grow economic development and support the community. This slide hopefully is familiar because I use it quite a bit. This poster is hanging up in the community development office space, and this appears in our State of the City presentation every year. But really, this vision is supported by 5 separate vision themes that further fleshed out our vision for North Kansas City, and each contained a series of principles to help explain this vision theme, kind of set out next steps for us to follow. So the next slide is vision theme number 1, grow and attract new and innovative business opportunities. I'll point out some of the principles here are to increase our development densities and to promote our proximity to downtown and to I-35. So really, one of the things we found in the market analysis is that the location of North Kansas City continues to be very important to our ability to support business here in really the heart of the metro. The next slide is vision theme number 2, attract new residents and increase homeownership rates. After Discovery Week, the thing that we started talking about as part of that process was, and from the market analysis was, what if we could double our population? And the support we found for this idea of doubling our population as a goal is turned into this vision theme. So I'll note the principles here. The very first one there is implement multiple strategies aimed to double daytime and nighttime population. We have increased supply of townhomes, loft style, multifamily options around centers of activity. And it says explicitly down there towards the bottom, expand housing to support retail businesses. So doubling our population, which we talked about quite a bit especially in the last half of the planning process, turned into this vision theme number 2. A lot more words to express kind of that same idea. Vision theme number 3, establish memorable destinations to create authentic and diverse public spaces. And a couple of the principles here about compact, walkable, mixed-use neighborhoods centered on active places.
Hey, Sarah.
Designing, yes.
Sorry to interrupt. Quick question on theme 2.
Sure.
If we could go back one slide. A lot of what I'm hearing around the new multifamily developments is that it runs in contrast to this theme about increasing home ownership rates. Now, the overarching vision theme in the early part of the discussion of it talks more about increasing population, and most of these bullets talk about increasing population. The only one that really pertains to home ownership in a way is bullet 2, where it says create a full spectrum of housing options for people to age in place. The rest of it doesn't really have much to do with home ownership, but the title does. So I'm a little confused.
We also have here assist low and moderate income renters to make the transition to home ownership. I would say from a practical point of view, we've just found it difficult to find projects that the city could undertake that would move the needle towards home ownership. But I don't want to close the door on the ability to do that. But I would point out, this is about home ownership. It's not about more single family homes.
Okay. Thank you.
So number 3, I would hope that those principles about compact, walkable, neighborhood centered on active places, and designing streetscapes to provide an enjoyable and safe experience for pedestrians might start to sound familiar, like some of the projects that we've been working on recently along those lines. And then vision theme number 4, another one that some of this should sound familiar, building a safe multimodal network and enhancing the pedestrian scaled environment. So we have some principles here about connectivity, safe pedestrian use of the street grid, connecting parks and open space with bike and pedestrian systems, improving our streetscape character. Hopefully this sounds familiar. And I would note the bottom one is maintain safe and effective truck improvements through industrial areas. So this is about all of the ways we move around town, not just one or 2 different types. And then the final one, vision theme number 5, preserve and enhance the local identity, uniqueness, and arts and culture assets. So we want North Kansas City to be beautiful and just a enjoyable place to be, and a place that uses its assets to maintain its uniqueness. So if you go to the next slide, there is a lot more in the master plan. We'd talk about expanding our downtown area. There's a whole section on implementation. We talk about organizing ourselves for success and economic development. We could spend a lot more time on that, but I wanted to point out, this is a long-term document, but we also have in page 63 talked about immediate next steps in 5 different categories here. And looking back on this, I do feel pretty good about our ability to complete some of these next step items. You know, we have updated our development codes in updating the zoning ordinance. We've adopted new policy about economic development tools and resources. We had a lot of conversation immediately after the plan was adopted about our organizational capacity and evaluating different organizational formats for dealing with economic development. You know, we undertake steps to ensure North Kansas City is redevelopment ready. You know, we've identified downtown area projects and advanced those projects with both our downtown streetscape and the 18th and Swift project. We have invested in North Kansas City through Catalyst Public Improvements. There are 4 things listed under that heading. One of them is the Burlington Corridor design. Number 2 is streetscape improvements for Armour Road. build streetscape improvements along Armour Road between downtown and interstate, focusing on an overall road diet east of Fayette. And man, we have definitely done that. Number 3 was make gateway improvements at key locations. We continue to work on that. We have that beautiful archway there at Burlington. And number 4 was implement bike shares as a first step in expanding the open space and trails network. The one that probably we have not gotten as far as the others is broaden plan ownership and engagement. And that's something where, you know, I think we could probably do more. I hope that this might set us up to take more steps on broadening plan ownership and engagement this presentation tonight. Because I think that if you look at page 63, we've done a pretty good job in moving towards these next steps in these 5 categories. So go to the next slide. Then that is all, if that's what's contained in our master plan, and we discussed, well, what has happened since then? I thought it would be helpful to think about the work that we've done and some of the outcomes that we've seen. So if you go to the next slide, and again, organizing this around our vision themes, that first vision theme in supporting our local economy, we've updated our framework for how we handle economic development. We updated our economic development policy. In updating the zoning ordinance, we really thought about compatible uses and making sure we were supporting our industrial districts in particular and protecting them from incompatible uses moving forward. And if you go to the next slide, there were a few indicators about the business environment in North Kansas City. We had not all businesses are required to get a business license. If you're regulated by the state, you generally do not need a local business license. So this doesn't capture every business in North Kansas City, but we had strong business growth, I would say, through March of 2020, when we were hit by the same waves that were affecting everybody else in the economy last year. Our employment, this is census data for people who come to North Kansas City for employment every day. 2018 is the most recent data available. We've had strong employment growth over the last few years. And there at the bottom, our total permit valuation. I would say 2020, if 2020 had happened in 2016, I would have felt pretty good about having a kind of continued strong investment in North Kansas City, but coming right after some major years of investment, it doesn't look quite as good. But it was still, last year was still better than 2008, 9, 10, right after the Great Recession for us. So lots of really good indicators about the business climate here in North Kansas City. Next slide, vision theme number 2 is attracting new residents. Obviously, we have focused a lot on completing the development of Northgate, and we're closing in on that, particularly with the development at 23rd and Swift moving forward this year. Gallery Lofts was an opportunity to attract new residents and also to do that in a way that provides more affordable housing. And 18th and Swift, obviously, another one supporting hopefully more retail development long-term. If you go to the next slide. So if we add up all of these units, we had 2,891 housing units in 2015. With the permits that we've already issued and the permits that are pending for the 23rd and Swift and Gallery Lofts, that gets us 32% of the way to our goal of doubling the number of housing units that we have in North Kansas City. And I always think it's interesting, if you look at our residents by generation, over the last 5 years, millennials have become our biggest demographic group by generation. And we were a kind of an older community in 2015, 2014, when we started on all of this. Moving on to the next slide, so vision theme number 3 about memorable destinations. So part of that is about our updated zoning ordinance and ensuring that communities, particularly in our core area, or new development in our core area, is contributing to an active streetscape environment. Our downtown streetscape project is another opportunity we have to refresh downtown North Kansas City as a memorable destination. And we've got some interesting destinations happening in terms of private development to build on. And vision theme number 4, on the next slide, We've definitely done a lot of work on a multimodal network. Not only just the bike related projects we've got going on, but also coordinating with KCATA and our Northland neighbors around the North Oak transit project, because that is a very important connection to downtown Kansas City, Missouri, but also up to Gladstone and Kansas City North. And then the next slide, for our local identity and culture. We've done a lot of work on public art and beautification and our gateways and wayfinding to help us achieve this goal as well. So that is the overview of the master plan. So the last slide here is just an opportunity for you to ask any questions that you might have about this.
So can we switch back to the full council screen?
Yeah. I have a question. I don't know if you can see us, Eric. We're back.
Yes, I did, sir.
Okay. Really more of a comment. Like kind of like Jesse brought up, increasing population can bring us so many added benefits as far as retail, grocery store, what have you to get here. I'd like to explore maybe a little bit more about what we can do for like increasing maybe some home ownership rates. But, I found it interesting that one of the things on the master plan is extending the downtown, and that's what we've tried to do with the Armour Road Complete Street project. Mm-hmm. So, it's just having a discussion about these issues about where we want to go forward. It looks like staff has been following the master plan that we've developed. And so that's where, if residents wonder where some of this stuff is coming from, it's coming from the master plan. That's my comments at this time.
Councilmember Smith.
Sarah, thanks for the presentation. It's very useful to see how it all came together and how it's kind of driving what we do. A couple questions. So you pointed out the time horizons for these decisions, and that was the part of my question before. So this plan was supposed to take us through 2035, which is great. It does sound like we're, making progress, headed in the right direction with it. You mentioned residential has a 100+ year time horizon. That makes sense for single family neighborhoods. Very difficult to ever redevelop a single family neighborhood. But what about, does multifamily have the same sort of time horizon, or does that fall into the commercial?
Oh, it varies so much. Probably it's closer to commercial.
Okay.
But you do find some multifamily developments that get towards that 100-year life cycle, like Kansas City, the Kansas City colonnades that you see like around Midtown. Mm-hmm. That big development time was in the 1920s and 30s. So some of those are getting in the 100-year. So it multifamily is just much more variable, but you are still, you're still looking at long lifespans.
Okay. Couple other questions. So I want to go back to, I touched on vision theme 2, where it mm-hmm. in my mind, it seems to have a bit of a conflicting vision, where we're looking to double the population, which I think is a great goal to have as far as supporting businesses and bringing in new interest into the city, but we need to do it the right way. And the right way is up for debate. And part of that does discuss the home ownership side. You mentioned that when you say home ownership, that doesn't necessarily mean building single family residences. We've got some townhomes, some row homes going up. The only other real ownership that I could come up with that I think about is condos, and mm-hmm. looking at what's going on in the market near us in Briarcliff, in River Market. Condos are very tricky to do correctly. The association fees get quite high. Mm-hmm. Special assessments come in. That's happening, I believe, with the Ravello and Briarcliff. So is there another component to home ownership that I'm not considering that you know of?
I don't think so.
Okay. And so when we have these RFPs and we put them out, are we looking at projects that bring home ownership into consideration? For example, with 23rd and Swift, that was part of the planned unit development. We needed to get the TIF activated as quickly as we could and start getting that revenue back. But the council only saw one plan that was selected by staff. Were there ones in that packet of applicants that had an ownership side? Were there some neighborhoods proposed? Or have we seen those kind of proposals?
So what we asked people to propose is a use for the project. We don't ask them to propose an ownership structure. So I would say there's nothing that prevents Star Development from deciding a few years, down the road that they would like to, take that project to a condo. That is not something that we don't tell people what kind of ownership structure they need to use. So that's one reason why I say the ownership piece of this vision theme is difficult for us to move the needle on, just because in our style of government, it's hard for us to force anyone into a particular ownership structure.
Okay, so they propose to build units, whether they're rental or ownership.
Yeah, they're proposing a use and a development. They're not proposing an ownership structure. That little bit different in 18th and Swift, because when we originally started on that, we wanted to control some of the parking, and we wanted to do that through ownership. So we got into the condominium there because we wanted to control part of the actual development. We were going to maintain ownership, but we were slightly different situation.
Okay. And then the last one that I was kind of picking up as we went through the 5 vision themes, almost every one of them had a bullet that talked about redevelopment, which in a city like ours, every development is pretty much a redevelopment, other than the super block, which, that's a 30-year redevelopment. So are we doing anything specifically to either scout for redevelopment, to incentivize the buildings that, in the industrial area that are, you mentioned obsolete, low ceiling heights? Are we doing anything to incentivize or, accelerate the redevelopment in those areas? Or are we just kind of waiting on the private sector to decide, we're tired of waiting on codes to swing around, or it would be too expensive to fix this building up? Is the city doing anything, or staff incentivizing that in any way?
Well, if you mean incentivized by economic development incentive, all of those come before you. When people make applications, we discuss those with the applicant, but then they come to you. So we're not providing any incentives that you are not aware of. Now, there are other ways to incentivize that. So not this last time we updated the building codes, but the time before, when we went to the 2012 codes, we adopted the International Existing Building Code. And that's one way that we saw to make it easier for people to pursue adaptive reuse, was to incorporate that into our family of codes. That was one of the focuses of the zoning ordinance, was trying to be really clear about non-conforming uses and how people could convert buildings, and what kind of regulations would apply. So we're trying to make it easier for people to navigate the process, and to be clear about what our goals are when people are doing redevelopment projects, whether that's an adaptive reuse or they're just doing a demo and starting over with a clear piece of ground. But if you're talking about monetary incentives, that's contained in our economic development policy, and we're that's all coming straight to you for your consideration.
I'm thinking more about proactively rather than waiting for them to come to us. So if, when we become aware of a building that is obsolete or vacant or, underutilized, are we doing anything to reach out and say, here's the possibilities that, are part of our economic development policy? Or are we waiting for them to just get tired of having
not always, partly because we don't always know when a building is obsolete. If a building has a tenant in it, it's hard to say that it's really obsolete, although it might not meet, like a lot of our industrial buildings might have a tenant in them, but not meet, current standards for clear heights and truck courts. But if there's a tenant in there, it's not necessarily an obsolete building. I'm sure Richard Lanning would not want you to describe some of his buildings as obsolete when they're full. That's
Sure.
one of the things that the market analysis told us, is that we've got a lot of buildings that might on their own be considered obsolete, but our vacancy rate is very low.
Sure.
People are still in those buildings.
And I'm not thinking about those as much. Finnegan's comes to mind. We've had the banquet hall next to the bowling alley set empty and underutilized for years. And I don't know if.
Right. On the other hand, people have been pursuing that property for years also.
Sure.
And, we know that there's a lot of private interest in doing that redevelopment. So not necessarily a reason for us to step in and try to undertake that ourselves.
Sure. Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Saper.
I've long been perplexed by the notion of doubling or even tripling the population of North Kansas City, in the sense of where would you put them? All the development we've had recently and in progress would probably at best put us maybe 500 to 1,000 population increase. And based on the 2020 census, which is already a done deal, they won't even be listed there. So I've often thought that maybe is a very unrealistic goal, as well as going back to Jesse's issue of properties. Many of the older industrial areas that we have here don't meet certain standards that are common in new construction. But on the other hand, they provide, in many cases, access because of our central location and lower cost for incubator industries and those trying to put them to different uses. And that's part of the ecology that we live in the metropolitan area, and we shouldn't dismiss that.
Well, I would point out, Councilmember Saper, that we are, with the 2 projects that we have pending, that will get us a third of the way towards our goal of doubling our population. So assuming the same household sizes, that's another 1,500 people. And we still have a good amount of vacant ground around our downtown where you could pursue redevelopment that would add more units without demolishing any industrial space. I agree with you that a lot of the space we have, it serves an important purpose, even if it's not meeting modern standards. But I think that it's a very doable goal to double our population. And we did test that goal as part of the master plan, looking at a focus area around downtown, and determined that it was feasible. Now, it may not be something that we achieve in the next 5 years. It may be a long-term goal. We didn't give ourselves a deadline. But we do think that it was a reasonable goal that we tested as part of the planning process, and that's why it was included in the plan.
Are there any further questions or comments? Councilmember DeLong?
A lot of great questions already been asked, so no need to go through a lot of it. I was going to ask about one specific item, though, I'm seeing on the next steps, is the North Kansas City Citizens Leadership Academy. Where do we currently stand with developing something like that?
We hope to be able to do that this year. We did put it on hold once COVID came last year. We were planning on trying to implement that in 2020, and then COVID came along, and it wasn't something that was doable given the situation. But as we come out of that, we really have a curriculum pretty well established. So I think once we're at a position where people can begin meeting again, that is something we can put before you for your consideration relatively quickly.
Great, thank you. I knew we were getting close. I just couldn't remember exactly where that was. Thank you.
Councilmember Smith, and then Mayor Sheila.
I'm also curious, and this may be a discussion for the next meeting, but what tools we have in our toolbox for places like the former Denim and Diamonds location that it's been vacant since just about after I moved here in 2013 or so.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, I know that it's caught up in a large web of legal issues, but what could we do as a city on things like that, where properties have sat vacant for many, many years? Do we have any tools to address those kind of things?
I feel like this is where you start to get the edge of my area of expertise as a planner, and this starts to get into Tom Barzzi's area. Yes, there are tools that we could use for a project like that to address a long-term vacancy. I mean, that building has been vacant as long as I've been here also.
I'll jump in and say,
yeah.
perhaps an obvious, answer, if it's always available, although it's always a difficult thing to do, is condemnation. If you become convinced that a use is just, not moving along, it's something that you really want to do, you can engage in the process of eminent domain to acquire the property, and that's one obvious possibility. Sure. Perhaps we can discuss others at maybe the next work session. There would be a time to talk about that, but that's one possibility that's always available to cities.
Okay, thank you.
Mayor Stilo. You're muted, sir.
Okay, there's two things. You're hearing a lot of stories now that by 2035 or something like that, the gas engine is going to be gone. We're going to be all electric cars and everything else. And that's going to change the way people live and the way they operate. I think that's something we need to take a look at. I have some place in California, they've decided they're not going to let anybody build another filling station. But that's beside the point. But, talking about vacant buildings, we've got a landowner here that owns about 4 or 5 houses that have sat empty for 20 years. And I was wondering, I think that try to figure out some way to either bring those houses back on the market or have them do something with it. It's a waste. We got one house that's sitting down there for over 20 years, not a sole limit. And I think something should be done about that.
And that's why we implemented the abandoned property registration program to try to.
It's not abandoned. He owns them and he takes care of them.
Right. But if they've been,
grass.
We established a series of criteria for what was considered abandoned, and vacancy is one of those criteria. So if it's vacant and I'm going to forget all of the criteria, but if you meet at least 3 of them, then it's considered abandoned. And part of the purpose of that was to make sure that they were not becoming, a problem for neighbors, but also just to try to nudge people into doing something with property that's vacant so that it can be returned to some sort of useful purpose, whether that's, getting a tenant in there or selling it to someone who is going to do something with it. Because we want all of our homes to be occupied, and we also don't want a vacant structure to become a nuisance for its neighbors, which is another concern.
Any other questions or comments regarding the master plan? All right. Well, Sarah, thank you very much. You went through what you covered a lot of territory in a short amount of time, and I invite the council to spend more time with the master plan. As I indicated earlier, during your regular meeting, we'll talk about proposed next steps for continuing this discussion of how the city develops, and look forward to getting your input at that time. So if there's nothing more, we can adjourn the work session.
Move to adjourn the work session.
Okay.
So just a quick note to please stay on this link. You are free to turn off your cameras and audio, but please do not log out of this Zoom meeting.
Okay.
Thank you.